great to have you all here. We're going to go around the virtual room or the virtual round table and do some quick introductions. So I'll introduce each of you by name, and then you can take the mic and introduce yourself, quick title, and then we'll go around the room that way, and then we'll start right into this. So let's start off with making sure we've got everyone. Yes. All right. So I'm going to start off introducing Lucy Bernholtz.
Hi, I'm Lucy Bernholtz. I'm delighted to be here this morning with you for this conversation. I'm the director of the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford.
Perfect. Thank you. Linda Essig.
Good morning. My name is Linda Essig. I'm here at the sunset of Los Angeles on the unceded land of the Tongva people. I'm the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters at Cal State University, Los Angeles.
Very good. And over to you, Bamuthi.
Hey, peace. My name is Mark Bamuthi Joseph. I'm originally from New York, live in the Bay Area, work in DC. I'm the Vice President and Artistic Director of Social Impact at the Kennedy Center.
Thank you. Sunil Iyengar.
Yes, hi. This is Sunil Iyengar, Director of Research and Analysis at the National Endowment for the Arts. Very pleased to be here. We're a proud co-sponsor of the National Endowment for the Arts Lab here.
Yes, thank you, especially. And last, we'll go over to John Leland.
Hi, very happy to be here. I'm the Vice President of Insights at Kickstarter.
Wonderful. Well, this is an exciting panel for me. It's a great way to start off our day. And I want to put a prompt question out to all of you. So in her presentation, Lucy talked about the importance of first principles in thinking about our systems. She pressed us to push beyond sort of the mushrooms that are just on the surface and look beneath and examine the soil underneath. I'd like to go around the panel here and ask, in light of the recent crises we're facing, what are the first principles that you think are most important for us to be keeping in mind here? Maybe let's start with Linda.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, before I answer the question about first principles, I really want to thank Doug and Joanna for the opportunity to share my thoughts with these esteemed panelists and with the many others watching. I also want to thank Indiana University for allowing me to defer its modest honorarium to an artist in need rather than accepting it myself. And I'm not sharing this to highlight my own righteousness, but because her story is emblematic of what working artists, especially working artists who serve communities of color, are facing right now in the world of COVID-19. Marta Carrillo is part of the Self-Help Graphics and Art Census Atelier, working toward a full count of all of the residents of East LA, as well as, under different circumstances, a resident artist with their Barrio Mobile Art Studio. She lost that contract work as a result of the pandemic, as did many artists around the country. So I'll come back to that. But first principles. So I'm hoping you'll allow me to have two first principles. The soil in which we work, and I want to share my observations of them. The first is the free market economy as a first principle, and the neoliberal version of it that we've lived in since 1980 is the soil. I really love Lucy's metaphor, but it's a soil that does not really provide the nourishment we need as a nation. It's a soil that's proven to be completely inadequate to the task of nourishing us during this time of crisis. As a system, it is inadequate to the task of producing and distributing necessary goods equitably in a time of crisis. The free market, as a first principle, has not provided masks or testing kits or even toilet paper efficiently. And I would add that the current regime's responses to Black Lives Matter protests, and a note to my colleague Tyler Cowan, who's speaking later, these are protests, they are not riots. That response is also one of the mushrooms that grows out of this sick soil, in that it favors property rights over human rights. And as Mark Bamuthi points out, there's a tension between public good and private wealth. And that free market soil really helps the latter to grow, but often at the expense of the former. So that's kind of the sick soil, but the healthy first principle is community level and individual action that we really see matter for community well-being right now. Whether it's our neighbors feeding neighbors or people in a cafe deciding whether or not to wear a mask, individual actions in community and neighborhood settings have literal life and death consequences. So we really need to look to community action during this time of crisis, and which I learned from Amaka Agbo's presentation is called restorative economics, a term that I really love. So this raises a whole bunch of questions for me, but I'll shut up now and let someone else have a chance for a change. Thanks.
It's a great place to start with lots of questions. And it's a good transition, I think, over to Mark Bamuthi for your thoughts on first principles here.
Yeah, that's hard because Linda did it. I feel like we can all go home now. It's true. The first principle is the relationship between the structural economy and the moral economy. It's really hard to move outside of that, and for me to think beyond that, because it literally is the root of evil in this country. And as we are out in the streets protesting and beginning to articulate notions of anti-racist systems, necessarily we connect anti-racism and anti-capitalism. And if not anti-capitalism, at the very least contra capitalism, if we were to take an incremental step. So it's hard for me to really think beyond that as a first principle, because it really is the root of division and social hierarchy here, access to resources. I do think that the collective psychology as a post-COVID response and principle, the nurturing of the collective psychology by reimagining what constitutes beauty and health in terms of the public imagination is another principle that we might look to. And by beauty and health, I don't just mean aesthetics. I mean the cultivation of narratives that embed us in an interdependent notion of our, and maybe a more liberal understanding of our collective humanity, a greater empathy. Working in the arts sector as a poet, as a practicing artist, and having institutional grounding at the Kennedy Center, among other institutions, I note whose stories are on stage, whose stories are on screen, what gets propagated as norm or normal. And this works across demographic classification, gender expression, sexuality, physical capacity and physical capital. So the diversification and the propagation of stories that uplift a more collective and democratic understanding of beauty, married to a relationship, a further evolution of the relationship between the structural economy and the moral economy, is what I propose as an additional principle.
That's great. Sunil, your thoughts on sort of first principles?
Thank you. Yes, and thanks to Lucy for raising that as the frame for this. I think that's a really helpful way to think about what we have to do now. I think I often think of two kind of first principles that maybe collide or intersect. Lately I've been brooding over the last couple of weeks over the statement. What we see on coins, the motto "E pluribus unum," which essentially means out of the many, the one. And I think what I'm talking about here is reconciling individual expression, the need for individual agency and voice, with that of a group, and really being larger, being part of something larger than ourselves, and being part of feeling less alone. And I think that's what the arts, at least historically and especially now, are showing themselves capable of doing. Bridging that. And so for individuals, we know, and this is from research, of course, we know a lot about the arts ability through creative arts therapies, through arts education, studio art, studies of studio arts, or even jazz improvisation. We've seen how it improves self-efficacy, it gives perspective taking, it really sort of shores up the individual and kind of elevates the individual voice and agency, as I said, and provides clarity. But then on the other side, we also see for the social benefits, the community-wide benefits. I think we all agree probably the arts are inherently social. Our data have shown 80% of people who go to an arts event did so because they wanted to be with family and friends. 60% of people who performed music, dance, or not necessarily formally performed dance, music, or theater did so to be with those same people. And more than 50% of people who make artwork, arts and craft, for example, did so for people they personally know. And I say that because, that suggests this deep community bonding element, which we're finding now, and especially now since we're spending so much time in virtual spaces. it's really critical to the arts. I'll just end by saying there's recently a study by the Knight Foundation who commissioned some work on this. They looked at about 11,000 adults across 26 cities, and they saw that residents who had access to the arts and perceived themselves as having access to arts and cultural activities showed far greater attachment and investment in their communities. And yet we know from our own data that 35% of people out there say they don't have access to arts and cultural amenities and resources. And that often emerges as a key barrier for why people don't engage in the arts. They don't have someone to go with, for example, or it's difficult to get to the physical location. So I'm kind of throwing all these data points just to point out that I think there's that individual and collective benefit, which are really part of the first principle.
Great. Well, thanks for that perspective. It's nice mixing this up a bit. And it's a good segue over to John if we think about sort of these virtual spaces and access. So your thoughts on first principles, John?
Thank you. And thank you to the other speakers. I mean, this has been a really beautiful conversation so far. I'll just mention what the first principles of Kickstarter are, which I don't think we've talked about publicly before. And you're gonna have to excuse the language here, but this is what our first principles are as written. Are fuck the monoculture and art and creative expression are essential, right? And there is a really interesting tension here between having a shared value of fuck the monoculture and actually fostering that. And I think, as we look at this current moment, what Bamuti sort of talked about in terms of reimagining notions of beauty and health, like what are the narratives we live by? What are the narratives and whose narratives do we listen to and do we value in our society? I think we go through periods where we've seen the sort of the culture kind of solidify in some respects about who we're valuing and who we listen to. And the internet, done well, it often hasn't been doing well, but done well, breaks open the possibility for new voices, new forms of expression, and new speakers of that expression into our lives. It's the responsibility of the platforms that host that work, though, and invited onto their platforms to be really stewards of that public space and of those values, to try to connect those voices and allow them to emerge with audiences that can hear them.
Very interesting. All right. Well, in a way, Lucy, you had the first word in this with your pre-recorded remarks. And so maybe it's only fitting that we go around the circle, at least as it appears on my screen, and give you your thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, I thank you, and thanks to all the panelists. That is already, there's no doubt that this group is inspired and more thoughtful on this than I am. I don't want to, it was just a metaphor, but I think the other two really first human principles that I have been thinking about a lot in my work are, I guess I would call them mutualism and pluralism. That we have this innate desire to gather together, to do things together. We are not, it's not just artists who are social, although I absolutely agree. Humans are social. We gather. We have, I think, an innate desire. I'm not a biologist, but there are plenty of them who've studied this. And then I think there's also this, in the creation of mutuality and the living of mutuality and the grouping of it, we create groups that have ins and outs. There are always in and out groups, or people who are in or out of the groups. And maybe this, that's what we're struggling with at all times. I absolutely agree with the statements about the nature of capitalism and the way it has set us up so that this moment is almost inevitable. But I also think the other I guess, first principle about humans, about people that I take great inspiration from is the imaginary. If you read Black liberation theory or Afrofuturism, this moment is what a privilege to be part of. What an extraordinary opportunity. So I guess the three I'd add there are mutualism, imaginary, and pluralism, and they're much more human-centered than system-centered principles, because the panel did such a great job on the system.
Well, thank you. So I think building out of those, we've each identified some of these first principles or major priorities. And I think embedded in most of those explicitly is that the current systems are either a bit toxic or aren't handling or addressing these first principles as well as we'd like them to. So the next question I want to throw out to the group is, what kind of systems or structures do you think we need to put into place in response to the first principles that you've identified? And for this, I'm going to experiment and not go in a pre-structured sequence. I'm going to let you each decide if we can pull this off, what order we go in. So feel free to jump in at this point. Someone.
I have no problem jumping in. You know that. No, just I think probably other panelists can speak to more tangible solutions from their perspective as practitioners or working artists. But I think what was said earlier about laying bare how vulnerable individual artists are and recognizing and finding a way to solve that problem. I know that with the CARES Act implementation grants that, for example, the National Endowment for the Arts is supporting, we're really after supporting jobs and hires, as well as providing space for artists and arts organizations. But if you look at the data just coming in, I mean, this is just from last week, it turns out that just the performing arts industry alone has lost about 48% employment, 48%, just from March to April. For small businesses especially, and I think if we think of the artists in a sense as small business owners, if we have to fit into that capitalist frame for policy purposes, we recognize that artists are essentially hurting the most among, except for maybe accommodate hotel, transportation kinds of workers. When you look at industry statistics from small business surveys that have been going out, 71% see a large negative effect from this and are experiencing it right now versus like 43% for small businesses as a whole. I say all that because we've only now begun to understand and quantify what arts workers as freelance workers, for example, freelance artists and very small businesses contribute to the economy. We now know they contribute a very high share, like about 20% of what the top 12 arts industries give to the total economy. And that's just one lens. And so again, I can't be prescriptive here, but I like what Lucy said about imagination, and maybe that can get us out of this with scenario planning and thinking about these stark disparities and how do we resolve them through this.
Can I jump in on that? I think imagination here is absolutely necessary, but I was really struck in Bamuti's remarks about some of it, the possibility of repurposing physical space, for example. When I heard that, I just thought, bingo, and in talking about institutions, it's sort of, we're used to looking at physical assets like that. And I absolutely agree there's a possibility there. And what an opportunity to step into some of these ideas about joint ownership, mutual cooperativism of the ownership of those assets, but also the governance of these resources, right? There is a real opportunity to not just repurpose the physical assets, but allow a whole new, healthier mushroom ecosystem of joint responsibility to flourish. And I'm sure this is actually already happening. I don't doubt for a second that there are communities around the country, no doubt with artists involved, that are beginning to do this. So I think that's an enormous opportunity. There's also, there's, with all of the digital infrastructure and the digitization of our culture that was in place prior to this year, there's an enormous amount of inquiry and experimentation with joint ownership of digital resources as well. And we're experiencing, and I'm sorry, my historian brain always goes back to that rhythm of the past, but mutual ownership, the commons, what a great moment to take those ideas and really put them into action.
Linda.
Yeah, I think just on both of those points, there's sort of this immediate action that can be taken, and I think this repurposing of spaces is one of those. But we have to look a little more long term, and we have an opportunity to imagine some longer term kinds of structures. I mean, I don't think anyone would argue, maybe they would, that many of our organizations are by design set up to maintain a certain status quo. And we might want to think about different kinds of organizational structures that are more responsive, that are more project oriented, that have more commons based, to use Lucy's term, funding kinds of models. I mean, I think we're at a turning point here. And yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd like to hop in and echo the Kickstarter foundational principle of fuck the monoculture, because nature loves diversity, and there is such a thing as cultural biodiversity. This kind of diversification of narrative and access to narrative, and I think so much follows from that. The relationship between the creative and the environmental, the relationship between the narrative and the physical asset of the planet, and systems that center, or an economy that really centers a kind of sustainability and interdependence. But with some apologies to Sunil, I think that I would like to see an additional federal agency. I guess not apologies, just adding on to. I would like to see an additional federal agency. I'd like to see a National Endowment for some kind of federally supported or federally sanctioned Department of Inspiration. And there was a case a few years ago. These kids in Detroit, at Detroit's worst performing high schools, sued the government of Michigan because they claimed that their 14th Amendment rights were being violated. They charged that under the 14th Amendment, they had a right to literacy. And I found this so moving because, coming from a people whose literacy was illegal for the better part of the country's history, certainly pre its founding and through the majority of its history, I thought that was such a compelling and robust notion that in order to have access to the franchise, you also must have access to letters, to communication. So that to me opens up a whole, a really beautiful and provocative prompt for all of us. Do you also have the right to clean air? Do you also have the right to water? If we look at Flint, not too far away from Detroit, not just their human rights, are the constitutional rights of the residents of Flint, Michigan, are those being violated because of the lack of access? Yes, the right to healthcare, all these things. So now working at a quasi-federal organization, certainly one that receives a healthy amount of government support as a living memorial to the 35th president, John F. Kennedy, I've kind of transposed that original prompt to think about inspiration for all as a democratic small d ideal that we can build systems around. So when folks ask me, well, what is social impact within the context of an arts center? That's often what I say, that inspiration itself is a democratic right. And if we were to build systems, not just in terms of the manufacture of art, but to secure for our country's citizens the right to inspiration, systemically, I think we'd be a lot better off.
Let's move. Thank you. Let's move it over to John.
Yeah, I think from my vantage point, speaking more practically about just the going back to the platform cooperative type model, that's something that we certainly have been looking at, and I think is kind of a moral imperative from the digital space, because there's really no good reason why Spotify should be owned by a giant corporation and shareholders when musicians are living so tenuously and barely able to make a living. Like these are the artists that are like hurting the most in the current crisis, that have obviously been the most vulnerable. And the internet provides such a great opportunity to reimagine the structures and reorganize ourselves at scale in very, very efficient ways. And we haven't really managed to create new, like, vibrant, large scale kind of capitalist structures through the internet. We just took the old system of capital aggregation, funneled it into this thing, and then blew up a bunch of companies, right? And so I think from our perspective, the hope is that we actually can lean into that possibility. There's nascent platforms like AmpLed, which is a platform cooperative that's trying to spin up kind of like a Patreon type model, but is a platform cooperative where the creators on that platform own the platform, unlike Patreon, which is owned by venture capitalists. Kickstarter, we are not owned by venture capitalists. We're a small private company. We're a public benefit corporation, but this is something we've explored. We're a small company. It's also really hard to make this change, to be honest. It's very complicated, but it's something that we're interested in trying to figure out how to do. But that should be the future that we're building towards. There actually isn't the infrastructure to build towards that future, right? So companies like AmpLed really struggle because it takes a lot of capital to hire engineers to build a platform like that. Your voice is so much smaller going up against a publicly traded company like Spotify, or a company like Patreon that has hundreds of millions of dollars in venture capital. There's no support structure for companies like that, and we have to think about, well, what is the alternative financial capital structure that can create platforms like that, and make them successful, kind of to deconstruct the existing model.
If I can just jump in for a second, that's why I started where I did, and to continue Lucy's metaphor, which I really love. I spent a lot of time in the last 15 years teaching artists to kind of work within a system that doesn't work for them, and Kickstarter is kind of a mushroom that really helped those artists, and Patreon and things like that. But they're still mushrooms in this soil that needs to change. So instead, I'm just wondering if there's a way, instead of us teaching artists to behave differently within a system that doesn't work for them, to instead change the system so it works for artists and all the other people. So yeah, thanks for the thumbs up.
Yeah, I don't know if they get to see the thumbs up in live streaming. So actually, I want to bounce it right back to you then, Linda, because as someone who works with arts entrepreneurs for a long time, I'm curious to hear your perspectives on what some of the new challenges. There's obviously a mismatch working in a system that isn't working for them kind of thing, but that's not necessarily new. What do you think are some of the new challenges and opportunities facing arts entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I've been thinking about that, and one of the things I'm writing about now, on my own until it sees the light of day, is how to help artists connect their work directly with their communities, without necessarily having to go through large organizational structures to do that. It's challenging, but it is also an opportunity. I think the number one opportunity is to make work that speaks to our current moment, right? I mean, that's, artists make work, right? And I love Pamuti's poem at the beginning of his talk. It was so, well, it was art, right? So we need to figure out a way to help artists make art. And yeah, I mean, that's the opportunity and that's the challenge. And we need to figure out a way to support artists who are making work, and to support, the people bagging our groceries now, and to support, the folks doing the food delivery. And we're not doing that yet. Yeah, I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, that was good. But actually, now that you've evoked Amuthi's presentation, I want to circle back to that and give him a chance to expand a bit on, especially this sort of call to ask ourselves, especially as artists, what are we doing in service of social health? And I want to give you a platform to go more with this because I think it was bold and important.
Thank you, and I really love the collegial spirit of this this panel. Thank you for nurturing it, Doug, and yeah, I really appreciate the mutualism here. The presentation for folks that haven't seen it, or the core concept is that artists should be deployed as in addition to the manufacture of films or poems or visual arts pieces, that creative thinking, that artistic intelligence, that creative intelligence should be more deeply integrated into our systems building. That we tend to position artists as weird and other. I've spent my whole adult life in the San Francisco Bay Area, and before that, as I said, I was born and raised in New York. There's a real danger. Again, to use John's term, the homogenization of San Francisco is a global danger, because somebody has to set the edge. Somebody has to be weird. Somebody has to provoke a kind of ethic sown inside of the public imagination that challenges us all to see beyond the obvious. Right now, so many of the gains, so many of the greatest minds, I think, that are in play in our collective economy are seeking to maximize financial capital, as opposed to, I have a 18-year-old son, I have a 14-year-old daughter. I notice in their generation that there's less of an urge to be great. There's more of an urge to be seen. It's a big difference. So artists, and I think artistic thinking as part of our systems engineering and our systems architecture is just incredibly important. Again, somebody just has to push the margins of the public imagination. I think artists do that. Unfortunately, I think the way that we've characterized that work is as entertainment, as kind of intellectually marginal, as off to the side, that artists just kind of like live up on a hill somewhere or go to like Artist Island and be weird there and then come back, something that we might enjoy and ingest, but again in the background. So this kind of is most salient to me in how we think about the public health, because I think what I say in the presentation is that we are soon going to shift from thinking about health as a virological reality to health as a mental and psychological reality. And I don't know who is stewarding for the country the reintegration of intimacy and close contact in public space as a public good. I think that there are incredible systems that we've devised to deport people. I think that the prison industrial complex is an incredible system. So if we can design these systems, I believe that we can also design freedom. I think that we can also design public good and public health. And to not enlist artists and artistic intelligence in that design would be a mistake. And so that's the thing that I think I spent the majority of the presentation advocating for, is assigning and deploying artists the same way that we would think about bringing several disciplines to bear if there were a Manhattan Project. If we thought of public health the same way that we thought of weapons building, who would we bring to the table? And hopefully it wouldn't just be scientists, it would be humanitarians as well.
That's great. I love this idea of deploying artists and moving them more mainstream and less weird, but also keeping and celebrating that weird and celebrating that fringe. But I have to stop talking because I need to pass this over to Sunil, who wants to jump in.
No, I was very inspired by Muthi. I thought that was a very, really liked your presentation. I think that's a core point that we all should think about. I guess it's more of a question just to ask if you feel any sectors are particularly ripe for that kind of transition or incorporation of artists and arts workers in that way. I mean, I think you mentioned public health, and there's been really some great, I think in the last few years, some very encouraging signs of coming together among local public health departments, arts and cultural agencies doing work, and artists. I can think of R&D and business communities where there's a big role for innovation through the arts. And I know there's been some attempts to have artists in residence and those kinds of programs. Are there particular sectors you think that are going to listen more to this call than others? Any of you? Just curious.
I'm biased, Sunil, but I would say public education.
I would say this is why Linda's foundational call in response to the first question is so important, because what are these sectors trying to do? The National Football League isn't a humanitarian organization. They're trying to, its bottom line is to make money using the instrument that's available to it, and to make money very specifically for its 30-something owners, which is why the commissioner of the National Football League comes out on Friday and says, yeah, Black Lives Matter, go ahead, kneel, protest. Right? And it's why you're seeing all these corporate statements, because it's very difficult to avoid the zeitgeist in this moment. So maybe a rephrasing of the question is that all sectors are ripe for this kind of integration and kind of, but they have to shift what they perceive as their bottom line. If the bottom line is only financial capital, then none of them are. But if the bottom line is social capital, political capital, if we think about equity, if we think about the equity inside of the moral economy, the same way that we think of equity inside of the financial economy, then it's wide open. But we have to go there first.
May I jump in? Because I completely agree. I'm very inspired by this. One of the things that I've often thought about is, often, and there's a whole literature on how people come together in disasters and all kinds of paradises get built and then they dissipate, it seems to me. One sector that I struggle with mightily, and my whole professional career is spent trying to understand this, is this thing called the nonprofit sector, which is as hierarchical and structured for capitalization purposes as any other industry. And it's also, I think, I was going to say fraying, but I don't think that's the right verb, but we'll use it for now, in ways that offer tremendous opportunity. And what you see around it, as we often also do in quote unquote disasters, are these community movements, social movements, these unstructured, informal ways of being that are driven by values other than financial value, which is also one of these first principles we keep sort of circling around. I often say to people, the number one, I live in San Francisco, number one financial value around here is efficiency. But if I were to list my top 10 values for you, it doesn't come anywhere. It's nowhere near the list. What happened to truth and beauty and justice and those kinds of things? So it's a long way of saying, I'm agreeing with whoever said it might be all sectors. I think everything is under such the foundations of almost everything, every public system we've built, and this adjacent nonprofit sector, and probably many corporations as well, are showing that they were built on quicksand. And how do we capture what's happening already? And I think the arts, if there's a sector it's where artists live. It's where people who pursue, I don't think of artists as weird so much as those who proudly pursue a set of other values first and foremost than the one that our current society has privileged above all others of efficiency. It's a wishy-washy answer in that I don't know how to make it more practical. But I think that there's tremendous possibility there. And I think we have to, I, for one, lead the charge in saying, let's reimagine this whole civic space, this whole civil society thing. It's got as many fractures and fissures and unuseful elements to it as the marketplace and the government as well.
It's good. Thank you. Well, so I want to take that as a chance to bounce it back over to John, who I think has lots to say, both about sort of different organizational structures and legal types. I'm glad you broached the nonprofit thing, because the NFL might be one of my favorite nonprofits out there, as a way of teaching us a lesson about what nonprofit really means. But John's got a different vantage on this. And I also want you to have a chance to comment on how you might think about this generally, about systems to support creativity, and what other insights you have. So maybe two different pieces that may or may not be something you can weave together, but go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if I can weave together, but this is such a great conversation. And I 100% agree with Bamuthi's, your point of like, what are we designing the system for? So Doug and Sunil are aware of a project I've been working on for quite some time now for Kickstarter, which is like, how do we evaluate our mission performance? How do we, we're a public benefit corporation. We are trying not to maximize, we're trying to create a different bottom line than just having financial return be our primary value. We're not a nonprofit, though. We want to create a sustainable business that can operate independently, just with a different bottom line than revenue. And so we have to evaluate, well, what is the value? What is the creative value of the work that we're supporting? What is our value in that process? And what is the diversity? What is the creative diversity of the ecosystem as a whole in order for it to be healthy? Those are very difficult questions to answer. And as I've gone through the process of trying to figure out how we can answer that question, what I found is in the US, the value is always money, right? All of the creative, any sort of creative value, nonprofit space, bottom line is, well, what's the economic impact of that? Right? And that's what we're designing for, which is, that is the bottom line. Like, so we have to reimagine, well, what are we designing the system for? And abroad, they've, in Europe, in other countries, they talk more about trying to find another bottom line, but nowhere has really done it well, as far as I've been able to find yet. And you still have the nonprofit problem, which is the frameworks and methodologies they've developed to try to form a different bottom line are being created by people that are in organizations that are just trying to justify their own existence and get funders, right? So it's actually kind of the same bottom line, but one step removed. And we're in a position where we're actually just doing this because we think it doesn't change anything in terms of our capital. We're just trying to create a healthier ecosystem. But no one that we've been able to find has actually created methodology for this without money as the thing that they're ultimately aiming at, as far as I can find. And what's beautiful about the moment that we're currently seeing in terms of the challenge to policing in the United States is that it is a discussion about, well, wait, what if we reimagine this entire thing? What if the value, this is the big part of the debate, right, is like reform versus defund, abolish the police. And everyone's kind of freaking out about abolish the police or defund the police, but it's opening up this conversation of a really radical reimagining of the underlying values of what this is and how we relate to each other in community. And that's if we can, all of these systems are interconnected actually at the end of the day. And if we can start reimagining, what we build our society for in one area, I think we can start pulling it into the rest.
Good. Linda, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm starting to form an idea. So I'm speaking it out loud to 250 people or however many are listening. But I think, we're talking a lot about systems, and I think the answers aren't going to be at that macro level, but really in community settings. And as I was thinking that, Lucy put something in the chat box about what about healthy community food systems. So when we look at arts activity in community settings, for communities, with community support, those have the potential to be healthier. When we even think about this notion of policing, if we invest in communities, in education and community arts and community services, and bring police in as community members, as part of a community, and then network these communities together. So in this utopian imaginary, to use Lucy's word again, she's good with the metaphors. Thank you, Lucy. Is this utopia of networked communities, where our communities are really working internally and then working across communities with one another. But the centralization of financial capital in a few small corporations, and to some extent a few large nonprofit organizations, works against that idea. And that's why you have people like the artist I mentioned, who is out of work. Right? There needs to be community level support for those folks. Just a thought.
Thank you. So I'm going to interject briefly here to also remind the audience that's out there to email in and tweet in questions. We're getting near an end time where we can start taking some. I've already seen there's a bunch of them that have been collected, but we're collecting more as we go. And I'm going to get fed some of these questions as we go. But maybe I'll give one last sort of question from me that I'm going to pop over to Sunil about what you see as some lessons learned here insofar as we react to the pandemic or other crises of the moment. What do you think are some of the lessons learned that have crossed your desk, Sunil?
So if I could just say, I happen to live in Maryland, and I don't think I'll ever be quite nostalgic about my morning commute into the city. But that said, one time I remember, way before all this happened, like years ago, I was commuting, and I was on my phone, as I often am, checking work messages, replying busily. Somebody I knew who didn't work at the National Endowment for the Arts came up to me and who I knew anyway, said to me, what are you doing? You look so engaged. She goes, there are no emergencies in the arts. She basically told me, because she knew I worked at the Arts Endowment. And how wrong that statement now is, I guess. Not only emergencies for the arts, but I think nationally, and how the arts are, clearly part of the solution, I think, as we're all saying, in a systemic way. I said that because it reminded me, and I think what I'm trying to get across here is a lot of what we've discussed so far, I think, necessarily involves starting some things from scratch, right? But I also want to shout out to the fact that there are sort of, there's some bright spots, right? Without being Pollyannish, there's some places where these convergences have been happening and can be built and made stronger. One thing I'd like to point out, which we didn't really discuss, and maybe this is a lesson learned, is we have a couple of great colleagues, Brian Lusher and Andy Mathis, who frequently go to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands well after the hurricane problems that happened, to assist with recovery and ongoing, not just fly in and leave, but really stay and help the communities there. And I think that kind of disaster relief consciousness, or that kind of mindset of emergency preparedness, is something that I think the arts now has to kind of take and sustain. And we have to continue to think about ourselves on the front lines of rebuilding in many of these cases. I just think a couple of quick things. Zanny Voss, some of you know, and Jill Robinson put a report out recently called The Long Haul, in it for the long haul, talking largely about nonprofit arts cultural organizations after the pandemic. And one of the things she says in it is local audiences, local talent, indeed the local supply chain will reign supreme. This is assuming that the travel industry is going to be hit very hard and we're not going to have the ability to be as geographically mobile. So I think that, again, throws us back in on ourselves and our local communities and finding solutions with our communities. And so, I don't know how that's operationalized, but I think that's a key lesson for me, is that the local supply chain really attending to the circles that are broadening out in these larger concentric circles for the arts and for people to participate more fully. I've set enough, but one quick thing, I think virtual engagement, as we talk about that, what that looks like in maintaining equity, inclusion in these platforms and ensuring that we don't move into a monolithic scenario with arts through the internet and online, and that we preserve these different voices somehow is going to be crucial as well.
That's great, Sunil. Thank you. You're continuing to set me up well on this. And I'm going to mention that one of the comments we're getting from the AEI backstage room is that you've been dropping a lot of statistics and numbers, Sunil, and people want to know your sources. They want to know where this research is coming from and have you share it. So maybe rather than have you list it all now, we'll find a way to get that info back to these people.
Oh, they really want to know that this is legit? Oh, man.
I don't think they're questioning. I think they're curious.
I thought I could just throw out fake numbers, but no.
But actually, the last point that you mentioned in your remarks there is something that comes to us, a question wants to build off that comes to us from Twitter, from Bente Bouthier. I probably butchered the name and I apologize for it, but I'll read it. And so it's, while many organizations have adapted to digital models during the pandemic, how could moving away from in-person consumption of art and exchange of ideas impact the arts sector long-term?
I just have an emotional response. And the emotional response comes from, I'm here in Washington, D.C. I don't live too far away from 1600 Black Lives Matter Plaza. And I rode my bike around this weekend and was moved, chilled, and a little scared as I weaved in and out of protests. Probably 95% of the people that were out had masks on, but there were a few that didn't. And the dual crises of, I guess one of the questions that was launched for me is, why are people out here literally risking their health? And I have to think that there's some understanding that we are only as safe as the members of our community who are most at risk. And so there's something about this moment where the risk was worth it for tens of thousands of people across all 50 states and dozens of countries. So let's transpose that to arts experiences and creative experiences. What's worth the risk of coming together in intimate space to engage in collectively in creative practices and creative imagination? What is the calculus in terms of our self-concept, our civic concept? What degree, what variable, what weight does public engagement hold in our self-concept and in our civic concept? This is lovely. I love seeing you guys in your boxes. You guys are gorgeous. I really appreciate it. But in terms of my self-concept, there's something missing here. There's so I think that what the arts sector has to consider, what we're all wrestling with, is that the virtual experience delivers content, but not humanity. The virtual experience isn't why we got into this thing, and it's not the function. It does not answer the question, what does our country need from us right now? Our country, I believe, needs for us to design systems that bring people back together, because everything then cascades over our economic well-being, our sense of morality. It cascades over into this thing of, if there is no public good, there's a difference, I guess, between something that happens in public and a public moment. You know what I mean? A public value. And so I think that the art sector can't go, the art sector has to figure out a way to evolve forward. It's the equity and the democracy that's demonstrated in having these virtual channels, the collective access that we have to sublime art that we may not have had before is amazing. And that's a fantastic content strategy, but it's not the actual mandate for the arts sector. It's not what the world needs right now.
Very interesting. Well, I think we have time to sneak in one other question here, at least. This one comes also from Twitter, from the Alliance for the Arts and Research Universities. What are we doing to give our citizens and our students in our current systems access and time to develop creative intelligence? Anyone want to take that one on?
I guess, being a dean in a university, this might be directed at me. We have to, whether it's virtually or in real time, provide students while they're in school, and I would say this K through graduate school, opportunities to fail and to figure stuff out. You don't build creative intelligence by doing something someone else told you to do over and over again. You build creative intelligence by doing new things and putting them out in the world and seeing if they fly. I think I mixed my metaphors, but ultimately it comes down to that, giving students opportunities to to develop their own voices. And one of our strategic priorities in the College of Arts and Letters at Cal State LA, product placement, is to build voices for social justice. That's a college priority, right? We have to give students an opportunity to do that, and to fail at doing that and be supported in that failure and get back up and dust off and do it again and grow creatively.
Other thoughts on this one?
I'll just jump in to say, I think just that building on that, the most creative spaces that I've seen built, particularly for like people, emerging artists, are ones that value the pursuit of new ideas rather than the actual success of them, right? If all you do is, and this is where actually digital platforms can often be really bad, because they value often success and are optimizing just for like getting there and winning the attention war almost, and the like war and all that stuff. But when you have a space that is just like, well, are you working on something? And is it kind of weird? Is it on the edge? Great. A lot of that stuff's going to be terrible, but it doesn't matter because that's where the best stuff emerges out of. And that I think I've seen very few spaces that actually build value systems where that is like kind of the culture and that's what's valued rather than was it really successful in the end.
Good, thanks. So I've got a remark and a question from Rachel Skaggs, who's at the Ohio State University, and she's in our backstage room in Zoom apparently. And here's what she writes. I love the conversation on arts thinking as key to systems building, which is definitely linked to creative placemaking and placekeeping and social practice art. Are there recent examples of arts interventions into society happening in your communities, or I'll just rephrase, are there examples of this that come to mind that you can share and discuss a bit?
Yeah, for me, it's hard not to think about what first what Theaster Gates has done in Chicago, on the south side of Chicago, what Rick Lowe has done with Project Row Houses in Third Ward in Houston, what Karan Davis has done on Crenshaw Avenue with Destination Crenshaw. all these examples are examples of creative communities hacking real estate and encouraging both inside and outside, not only a reclaiming of physical space, but claiming of psychological space. Again, going back to what we perceive as beautiful and valuable. But those, all those examples I think are very instructive because they do go back to the Black Panther Party's, principles. We want land, right? So where the arts sector, I think, is most successful in terms of making these kinds of incursions have everything to do with a kind of reclamation of square blocks, if not square miles, in major cities. Now, this can happen in rural communities and in urban communities as well. But these artists have essentially formed these small oases where creative enterprises or creative thought or a different kind of value system might flourish. They've created microeconomies, but they needed land to do it, not buildings, but square mileage, right? Square footage, not going straight up. So I think this too is one of those places where virtual space is exciting and offers a prompt in terms of and offers safe haven in terms of where ideas might flourish. But without space to grow in the material world, it's a little bit more difficult to attach that to our current economic system, to our current understanding of what value is and what is valuable. It's also interesting to me that the examples that I gave, Destination Crenshaw, Project Row Houses, and Rebuild, that these are prompts from the visual arts sector. And the economy in the visual arts sector is different than the economy in my sector, in the performing arts sector. Because if I make a dance, it has lots of value to me, but not as much value as the photograph behind me. As a matter of fact, this photograph can be sold, but my dance cannot, right? So there's a way that visual artists have used the financial resources from the sale of their work to then support themselves on a higher level, but also to create land bases from which their creative ideas might flourish. So those are three examples that I would cite, but they also open up a whole new can of worms in terms of how we get the financial resources to support these mini oases of interdependence, creative activity, and support for historically marginalized communities.
Great, thank you. All right, so I just got another great question from an email that I think is going to touch on something we've already talked about a little bit, where this distinction between sort of blowing stuff up and more radical reforms or reimaginings versus more incremental things. And I think generally a tension we all feel or see about trying to push to get back to the way things were. That these systems are designed often to be really resilient and to a fault in some obvious examples today. So here's the question from Priya Sarkar. How do the panelists see as the role of philanthropy in reimagining or dismantling the current system? Not a small question, but small answers are okay.
Well, I just thought that, all of us, those of us who are in arts funding organizations, we know that cross-sectoral funding, cross-sectoral initiatives, that's been a kind of buzzword for the last several years among the philanthropist community. And I think now we're in a position to, really look at which kinds of mashups of sectors are maybe most viable, even in the short term. And I think, again, I can only say, I love the examples just given about what we might consider creative placemaking, if we had to label it. But I think that's a really strong, vibrant sector within the arts alone. I think a lot of the work around arts and health, arts and public health, but also arts being used in clinics and out of clinic settings for a range of services that we might consider social services, and substance abuse to trauma recovery, a whole bunch of things. I think there's already some embeddedness going on there. Now, I don't think that we're in a position to say it's gotten to where we all would like it, where the arts and artists doing the work of this are valued as instrumental to these systems. But I think we're much further along. And I think from our little corner of the world, I think what we can do is try to, for example, support research and build up evidence that will speak to those communities, which are using different vocabularies from all of us, right? And really speak their language a little bit. It does require maybe a little discomfort because we want rapid change. We want radical change in many cases, systemically, that's warranted. But I think at the same time, doing it incrementally is the only real, I think, viable short to medium term solution, being a relentless incrementalist, about this. And yet, while doing that, not losing sight of the vision, So I think we've made some progress as funders together in collaborating with other kinds of funders, whether it's collaborations with arts funders and say the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, or looking at certainly other organizations that are doing work in place-based initiatives where the arts isn't necessarily central to their mission. I think that has to continue.
John. Oh, go ahead, Lucy. Let's go, Lucy.
I was just going to say, I think there's a really interesting possibility here that's occurring to me from this whole conversation. One of the things that, and I mostly work with philanthropic foundations who are by law required to fund institutions. And then you've got something like a Kickstarter and the revisibility, not that they're not new, they've been there forever, but a new visibility on mutual aid support networks, right? The arts is an area sort of in this siloed world we think of where the individual and a collective of people is still really recognized as the power, as the creative energy, not the institution itself. So how can we encourage the big money that's locked up in these big foundations that by norm and law fund organizations only, and we can't get the money to the people, and things like Kickstarter, bail funds, mutual aid networks, where there's been this reattention to the fact that we had a presidential candidate who socialized the phrase universal basic income, didn't succeed in it, but really shift the attention. I'm not anti-institution, but we're talking about people here. I mean, Linda started us off talking about an individual artist. So is there a way to deliberately hybridize some of this, keeping the power in the distributed networks, but the money is locked up in these big piles, and distributing it out through these networks where the individual and the collective is the center of energy, and let those be I'm gonna now metaphor mash, mushroom up some new institutional structures for us. I think we've got some, and the rules that make philanthropy work the way it works are utterly changeable. They're human rules. We made them, we wrote them, we can rewrite them. But that recognition, and there's such power in that, because I'm having a hard time at thinking of any other sector of philanthropy where we know the creative energy is not the institution as much as the individuals. I'm not coming up with it. We don't, anyway. So I think there's a real moment there to reimagine some of these systems. Maybe we could stop locking people up so we stop needing bail, and we can use bail funds as art funds or something like that. Ties right back into the police defunding situation. All of that money, redirecting it.
John.
Yeah, okay. I'll try to be quick about this because one, I've been working on this problem at Kickstarter for a while as well. Yeah, we're trying to access those giant pools of capital and then redistribute them at scale to a lot of individuals, right? Like, and this is actually something I've been pitching foundations and philanthropy institutions for a while. In my spare time, it's not my primary job, I guess, but it's something that makes total sense. And it's very hard to get those institutions to change, and we have to basically launder the money. because it's not set up for this. So I have to take a foundation. I worked with the Knight Foundation on this. The Knight Foundation made a grant to American Documentary, and then American Documentary pledged into campaigns, right? And in talking to them about this program, my point is that I was like, if we have $500,000, I would much rather have $200,000 going to 100 artists in very small amounts that we can leverage through our platform, through community, adding it to community support through a platform like Kickstarter, than 5 grants of $100,000, right? Because those 5 grants of $100,000 tend to go to people that are very privileged in cities with connections to large institutions, and they tend to look more like me. And we want to be in very small towns across everywhere with access to everyone, and that small amount can catalyze a huge change for those artists' lives. So that's one piece of this. So we're working on this. If people want to talk about this, please reach out to me. And the other thing I want to mention here actually comes from the climate work I do, because I'm also head of sustainability at Kickstarter, and I do a lot of climate change work. And there's a problem in climate change that is being solved that I don't see being solved in some of the problems that we're talking about, which is the gap between traditional philanthropy and venture capital, right? So in climate change, you can have charities that just donate money to something that's doing, fighting climate change, but isn't seeking return. It tends to be a nonprofit. Or you have venture capitalists that are trying to make a 10x, 20x return. And it leaves this massive gap of opportunity where you need a ton of capital going into companies and solutions that may just return the capital, right? It'll give them, if things work out well, it's 1 or 2x return to the granting institution. And I actually don't have things set up for that. Mechanisms or capital frameworks to really do that kind of capital allocation. And that's something as we think about, well, what do we need to rebuild the institutions, the foundations of how arts are supported, shared, distributed, made in society. We have this massive gap there where, again, coming back to a company like AmpLed, which I really want to succeed even if it hurts Kickstarter, there's no capital for them because they're not going to get philanthropy money because they aren't a nonprofit, and they're not going to get venture capital money because they aren't maximizing financial return. But ultimately, that solution is, if it can flourish and be self-sustainable, is far more impactful and equitable than what most nonprofits are doing, and certainly for-profit companies are doing. And so thinking about different ways to deploy capital in ways that are sustainable, that help grow a better soil, develop a better soil for us, is something that I think needs to be considered.
If I can just jump in here, and unfortunately, I just have to challenge the premise of the question, because with philanthropy, the core of philanthropic giving is over generations, an individual, a family has made zillions of dollars destroying the planet, and then spends 0.001% of the zillions of dollars that they've made to, and there's a graphic going around right now where New York City is spending something like $6 billion on its police force and $750 million on youth and community development. The question isn't for philanthropy, whose model is, thanks to John and to Lucy, to Sunil, really all four of you that are rethinking how funds are distributed in terms of the public good. But it's a trap to ask, what could philanthropy be doing better? This goes back to, Lucy's citing of Andrew Yang and a universal basic income. It goes back to a kind of pre-Reagan, 1950s, 1960s tax structure, quite honestly. What are, this is back to a Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren reading of the tax code. It's just, I love Elizabeth Warren's idea of a billionaire tax, which is like, make your money, man. But after a while, how much, right? So I just want to I love all the innovations that are being made in the realm of philanthropy, but I just think that we have to challenge the premise of the question itself, because it places an undue burden, the same way that I think that we place sometimes an undue burden on artists to come in and do a poem for disadvantaged kids, and then we're mad when racism doesn't end at the end of the poem. You know what I mean? It doesn't work like that in terms of the moral landscape, and it doesn't work like that in terms of the financial landscape. We really have to rethink our tax structure and what our priorities are in terms of the civic good. It can't just be on philanthropy to undo all these systemic pathologies.
On that, thank you. I really am excited that we ended this in some ways with questioning the premise and the question in the first place. I take that as a huge sign of success for the conversation, that we've accomplished a lot there. And I wish we could go on much longer, actually, in part because I've got a giant stack of questions that only seem to keep getting better from the audience. So there's a lot of demand and curiosity for what you all have to say, which just means I have to be especially thankful to all of my panelists, all 5 of you, for coming together, joining us, having this conversation. Thank you very much. Does anybody have a last word or 6 they want to throw in? We run into the lunch hour. I don't see any digital hands going up. So with that, thank you all very much. Everyone else, stay tuned. You can keep watching this. We get a little information about our center, but otherwise we're going to be back, I believe, at 1 o'clock for panel B, which should also be very exciting. Thank you all, everybody.
Really appreciate y'all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you very much.